Now, since the beginning of this month, the face of the South African financial services sector changed. The Twin Peaks regulation will not only have authority over every South African business that offers a financial product or service, but also offer far more protection to consumers in the financial services space. Dr. Andy Schmulow, who's a senior advisor at Datta Burton and Associates, joins me now for more on the changes. Andy, Doc, how shall I refer to you?
Andy's fine.
Thanks so much for your time. Right, so just for the interest of people who maybe are a little bit ignorant as to what Twin Peaks are, in the simplest form, how would you describe or define this Twin Peaks model?
Two peak regulatory agencies. One is charged with making sure the financial system doesn't have a crisis. The other one is charged with making sure consumers are protected.
Okay. How do you do that, though, successfully?
It's extremely difficult, and statistically, the odds are against success. So there are very few countries that can point to consistent success in the space, and probably the only one that comes to my mind would be Singapore.
Right. We were speaking briefly off air about the Australian Twin Peaks system, which is what ours has mirrored. And you were telling me that there's something quite troubling with how the Australian Twin Peaks system has worked. Can you please share more details?
Well, it's a disaster. It's in a state of absolute crisis. We have a Royal Commission of Inquiry at the moment, which has uncovered so much consumer abuse and such poor performance by the regulators that our former Prime Minister suggested 2 or 3 days ago that one of our peak regulators simply be shut down, that it's just a complete waste of money.
What kind of consumer abuse?
Things like charging people tens or hundreds of thousands of rands for financial advice 10 years after they died, and knowing they were doing it and covering it up and lying about it to the regulator, and then awarding each other bonuses on how much they'd charge dead people for financial advice. Or Commonwealth Bank that breached money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regulations 53,700 times.
Why was it so easy for people or businesses to crook the system in Australia? Because this is very worrying about what it can mean for us here in South Africa.
Our regulators have been captured. And I know that South Africans have a very strong and keen understanding of a certain type of capture. So when South Africans think about capture, they think about money changing hands and then control of a government department. In point of fact, capture is, generally speaking, far more subtle than that. So it can be things like, I'm just not going to get tough on a regulated entity because I don't want to upset them. They might offer me a job when I'm ready to leave here. So that kind of softly approach that creeps in. Or the kind of ideological capture that you get from people who join a regulator with the attitude, what's good for the banks is good for the country. Now, sometimes what's good for the banks is good for the country, but not always. So we now had a Productivity Commission report in January that said Australia's banks have become a cosy 4-bank oligopoly where there's so little competition that they're sucking the lifeblood out of Australia's economy.
Sure.
Things have reached a crisis point in Australia.
What's been done?
We have a Royal Commission of Inquiry. We have a commissioner who was a former judge of Australia's Supreme Court of Appeal. And that dog is off the leash. He's running. And he's just raking up muck and scandal and dishonesty and corruption that is leaving the country reeling.
Right.
So I was asked to join a panel of advisors to provide advice to South Africa's Treasury on South Africa's adoption of Twin Peaks. And I think South Africa has copied the best parts of the Australian model. I think they've done that very well. But I've been advocating to them consistently for many months now, you need to think about the implementation. You need to think about the fact that this is supposed to be a tough cop, not a popularity contest. And I must say I've been very impressed by the reception that I've had from the South African Treasury. I've encountered people who are smart, they're on the ball, they've got a fire in their belly, they have very clear ideas of what the financial system should achieve, which is that it should be there for the community, not the community there for the financial system. And I've been very impressed.
For sure. I mean, in terms of your communication with our government officials, I'm sure you must have had conversations about what went wrong there in Australia. You say that we've taken the best bits from Australia. Have we, for instance, ramped up security there, particularly when it comes to the ease of abusing the consumer? Have we ramped up security on that peak to ensure that that doesn't happen here?
There is certainly security, as you put it, but you know there's security in Australia as well. So the regulators, the government has, our government is running around like a headless chicken, dishing out more power to the regulators. And as a number of commentators have pointed out, the problem isn't that our regulators don't have enough power, it's that they don't have any willpower. So how do you inculcate willpower? How do you inculcate culture? A strong driving enforcement culture into a regulatory agency. And one of the things I've been able to bring to my discussions with the South African authorities is discussions I've had with people in, for example, the United States who are instrumental in setting up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that has an enforcement culture and an independence that is so strong that they've even resisted attacks from Donald Trump. So these are the kind of really difficult, nuanced, delicate things that go behind the scenes to make this very good architecture a success.
Andy, at the beginning you mentioned that Singapore was an example of a country that had successfully implemented this twin peaks model.
They've successfully implemented implementation. Their implementation is successful. Their model is a single regulator model. So they've got a suboptimal model, and this is one of the lessons that we need to learn, is that you can have the best architecture, but without adequate implementation, it's meaningless. Whereas if you had less than the best architecture, but really good implementation, you'd be okay. So implementation is it's the linchpin around which everything turns.
No, for sure. We know that as South Africans pretty well, particularly South Africans who have been supporting the ruling party, the African National Congress, for all these years. Andy, we're going to leave it there for now, but thanks so much for those insights. Yeah, that was Dr. Andy Schmulow, who's a senior advisor at Datta Burton and Associates.